means to look and seek. And so it translates as, it's not wrong to fetch what is at risk of being lost. And so we saw in both of those readings that things that were in the past that maybe give us a greater sense of what has happened or who we are, we have to go and retrieve those things. So it's an interesting idea to consider, because sometimes we're told that we should always look forward. Why, some people ask, do we want to constantly be stirring up the discords and discontents of the past? Isn't it better to just always give ourselves a clean slate for every day and to stay in that present moment? Well, in some ways that's helpful, but as we create the future, it's also helpful to bring the learnings of the past into the present and either discard them or build upon what our ancestors have given us. And so, as you can imagine, this symbol is very powerful in the African American community, and it invokes their remembrance of centuries of struggle, of determination, the will to continue building a just and beautiful society. And they keep their history alive through storytelling, through music, through dance, as well as through honoring their leaders, through community building and celebration, even through the naming of their children sometimes. And so they're constantly re-embedding the truth of who they are into their current lives. However, this Sankofa process, this process of radical self-examination and gathering of wisdom, is something that we can all benefit from as individuals as well as communities. And so what if we asked ourselves, what are we bringing forward that is worth saving? What are we currently nurturing now that is laying the groundwork for the future? So Sankofa is more than just recalling events. It's the recognition that it's impossible for us to be disconnected from the past. And to that end, it's so important that we know what the past is that we're actually talking about. Well, civil rights activist and Professor Kwame Jeffries says that we all suffer for the poor history that we've been taught. We all suffer for the poor history that we've been taught. Sometimes we were told wrong things in school. Sometimes we weren't told anything at all. Sometimes we thought we know the story, but the truth is never fixed. So you just have to stay open to the revision of the narrative. And so many of us are old enough to remember how we were told that Columbus discovered America in 1492, right? That's the word. That's the final word. That's how this country got started. Yeah. But happily, a sort of a Sankofa process has enabled us to bring that around and understand that, oh yeah, there were a lot of people living here before Columbus got here. And so now we celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day instead of Columbus Day. But we really do still have far to go. How often do we right here in Galveston acknowledge that we are on the ground of the Atakapa and the Karankawa Indians? A lot of congregations do land acknowledgments at the starts of their service. And so our dismissal or maybe ignoring that fact can be harmful, as illustrated by the story that Madeline read about Alex Perez, because when you don't know who you are and you don't know how to make sense of your family's stories and the feelings that you have in your own bodies about who you might be, well, to have that restored is really a gift, And looking back helps us to grieve as well what we might have lost. But it also helps us to recover and understand ourselves and maybe find new rituals and intentions for what lies ahead. So in Alex's case, he works with the indigenous people of the Coastal Bend now. And maybe some of you have heard of that. It's a nonprofit which works to minimize corporate exploitation and damages to the beaches and waterways right around here. And so that's what he did with his Sankofa life. Well, when we live Sankofa in our personal lives, it often starts with a quest for family knowledge, like Linda was talking about, finding her ancestor, and how that resonates with us as individuals and in community. And sometimes we notice that the past was painful or incomplete, but we also can take that egg of wisdom and go forward into what philosopher Charles Eisenstein calls the most beautiful world that our heart knows is possible. Because Sankofa is why survivors of child abuse grow up to become social workers and therapists. It's why you become maybe a writer or an artist or a musician. You find ways to honor the strengths of your family, your past. Maybe your dad wanted to be an artist, but he never had the chance to do that, and so you decided to cultivate that. Well, I've been on a Sankofa quest of my own in a way. Unlike Alex Perez, I didn't have to have a DNA test to know that I was from the mountains of western North Carolina, and my people were from Scotland and Ireland. And so I knew that I had a spirit that came from them. I knew that I was good at going through adversity, and I figured I got that from them. But I still did have questions because a lot of those things didn't ever get talked about. Why, when I knew what I was capable of, didn't I achieve more earlier in my life? Why was I mild-mannered, and why was I a people pleaser? Why did I think it was selfish to want things? Why was I uncomfortable sometimes with money? And so I went to the past, and I started looking for my ancestors, and I went to the graveyards out in the Christmas tree farms of the Blue Ridge, and I went to the archives, and I drank coffee with my oldest living relatives, and I found my great-grandmother, Linda. I found a tintype too. And there's a picture of one when she's 16 years old, and that's when she got married. And then there's another one of her when she's 45, and she was the mother of 12. And in both photographs, in both of those images, she had a really sad, downturned mouth, and she's wearing the same little skimpy piece of lace around her neck, the same piece. And so there seemed to be a level of deprivation and scarcity there. And I figure I may have inherited some of that. And another great-grandmother I found had been a farmer's wife. At least she did something. She ran away from home. But for her trouble, she was pursued and she was captured and she was placed in an insane asylum. Because in those days, if you left your husband, you just couldn't go all eat, pray, love. You were going to get punished. Yes. So women who did those kinds of things were considered crazy. And so when I found out about them, I said, thank you, ladies. I know you tried your best, but the buck's going to stop right here. And so I thank you and I honor you, but with every fiber of my being, I'm going to be a spiritual game changer. And so that's one of the reasons why I stand before you today. And so how does Sankofa land with you in your individual lives? What were the points of pain in your family trees so that you could find the silver lining? We're thinking about. But Sankofa is really about more than just individuals. It's about community. And so we have to ask how it lands with us as a community as we do the work of opening our hearts and minds and doors and practices to all. And so what does history tell us is our legacy? And how are we going to use that to inform how we continue to build beloved community, not only in our country, but in Unitarian Universalism? So it's essential that we look back to capture our history and see our blind spots and our exclusions, and at times our misplaced self-satisfaction, because we flatter ourselves, who is more woke than Unitarians? When we think about who we want to be as a church or a nation, in the way that we welcome others, what do we really find? And so sometimes we may look to minimize our mistakes. Are we, for example, looking to see what our white privilege tells us about our responsibility and how we're going to use the past and use that to make changes? Because again, as Kwame Jeffries said, we all suffer for the poor history that we've been taught. And so remember that reading I read from Thandeka. It's a kind of a Sankofa story. It's a history that's been hidden and forgotten, but one which maybe should be brought forward into the light. And so she tells a story about a time when blacks and whites once stood shoulder to shoulder against oppression. They were united by their common class standing. They lived and worked together, and if there was any tension between them, it was just typical of the things that happened in the human species. because believe it or not, it didn't have a lot to do with color back then. She tells the story of how not race, but class was the important divider in society at one time. And so in the formative days of our nation, white upper-class land and factory owners started to pass these laws that drove a wedge between white and black workers. And we know now, we can see now that they actually despised white indentured servants as a subset of humanity, as a lower order of being. And then they used that to help them to feel superior. Blacks were considered uncivilized and were valuable for their labor. Until 1660, the majority of labor on Virginia tobacco plantations were underfed, poorly housed, and clothed and indentured white servants. But in the 17th century, slavery began to be the preferred way of obtaining labor. And so that's when they started to pass these laws. Law by diabolical law. What began as a classist ploy by the 1% transmuted into a lower class psychological need for racist separation. So the lower class white people bought into this that had been legislated and taught to them. And so that racism grew and became more horrible as time went on. And the camaraderie and the understanding that had formerly existed between people of different colors who had similar social standing and status, that began to disappear. And so, as I told you, when I look back at my own ancestry, I can find some of those same poor white immigrants, some of those manual laborers. And it explains a lot about why I have struggled with things like wealth and self-worth. And it also explains to me why I've also felt such an affinity for the underdog, for the poor, for the oppressed minority. And so if we look back and if we look deep, as the Sankofa process has taught us, we can see that in many ways we really were taught to be white. And we were asked to buy into a storyline which serves the interests of just a few. So in the deepest sense, aren't we really aligned in the human struggle? Whoever we are. Who were we before we became who we are now? That's what Sankofa teaches us. It's not too late to remember who you are. So claim your history, as Alex Perez did, as Black Americans have done. Our true inheritance is not one of hatred and separation. It is a way of being in which we are connected to each other. We are connected to ourselves, rich in companionship and friendship, in love. It's a way of being in which the spirit of life makes us eternal allies, in solidarity for our common future. So remember Sankofa, and don't forget, and let us not fail to take our wisdom forward. Do it for you, and do it for the world. Amen.